Hello, my name is Jim Amers and I'm an Associate Professor of Anthropology at the State University of New York in Geneseo, New York. I'm a Maya archaeologist who specializes in pottery, but today I want to talk about queer archaeology. This video is meant to be a companion to my chapter in the open access textbook LGBTQ Studies, an open introduction, which is freely available online. You can also use the glossary of that book to find definitions of some of the terms which will be highlighted in this presentation. So what is queer archaeology? Simply put, queer archaeology is the use of queer theory in archaeology. But I realize that doesn't get us very far. So we need to ask, what is queer theory? Like all theoretical perspectives, queer theory can be considered a way of looking at the world. For a very readable introduction to queer theory, I'd recommend Barker and Shealy's 2016 book, Queer, A Graphic History. They note that queer theory is always changing and is used in different ways by different people, but we can find some unifying themes if we look at queer theory's history. Queer theory's origins lie to a great extent in feminism, which has, among other things, questioned our assumptions about gender, sex, and sexuality. For example, feminists have long challenged the idea that it is somehow natural for women to be submissive and to work in the home. This is an example of feminism challenging what we would call a normative assumption about women. A normative assumption about men would be that men are naturally violent and sexually aggressive. Both of these ideas are related to essentialism. Essentialism has deep roots in Western philosophy and is still a very common and controversial way of thinking about people. Essentialism suggests that, for example, men and women have fixed, inborn qualities or essences that can be used to explain their behavior. These fixed, inborn characteristics would be the same in men and women in all times and places. Another example of essentialism is the racist belief that groups of people have certain psychological and social characteristics that can be identified based simply on the way they look. Many people challenge essentialism with what is called social constructionism. This is the idea that most of our behaviors and beliefs are a result of social learning as members of various groups. The great variation we see across the world in norms about gender, sex, and sexuality tends to support the social constructionist view, although this is a complex issue that I can't really resolve here. But there are really a lot of great resources on the internet on essentialism versus social constructionism. In archaeology, an important way that essentialism and normativity exist is in the categorizations that archaeologists create and use, and queer theory demands that we examine even the most basic assumptions underlying those categories. This aspect of queer theory reflects its debt to critical theory. For example, one of the most basic assumptions that most people make is that humans come in two dichotomous sexes, male and female. Archaeologists specializing in human remains, called bioarchaeologists or physical anthropologists, have traditionally assumed that any human body can be classified as either male or female. Unfortunately, human biology is not that simple. Over 1.5% of human newborns are intersex. That is, they exhibit at least some characteristics of both biological sexes. Further complicating this picture is the fact that biological sex is multifaceted, potentially designated in reference to chromosomes or DNA, hormones, breasts, genitalia, reproductive abilities, or, in archaeology, skeletal characteristics. As the biologist Anne Fausto Sterling noted, quote, labeling someone a man or a woman is a social decision. You can see the power of normativity in the fact that even today, intersex births are rarely discussed, and those newborns are often surgically operated upon to align them with male or female biology. Although this is changing as adult intersex people have begun to demand that they be able to make that decision later in life. A very simple example of the influence of queer theory in archaeology is that many bioarchaeologists no longer begin with the assumption that any excavated body will fall neatly into the category of male or female. When the categorization system is opened up to allow for more than two sexes, surprise, intersex people may be visible. This may be the case for a royal burial at the ancient Maya site of Copan, Honduras. In 2006, Perry and Potter suggested approaching sex in a similar way to race, as a social construct, noting that, quote, the ways in which race is described as a social construct may be translatable to sex. What we understand to be a biological sex is composed of a diverse set of variables that may not invariably pattern out to what we socially comprehend as male and female. Furthermore, we can't assume that physical sex differences were as important to people in the past as they are to us, and that they were given as much weight in identifying people. Even contemporary ideas about sex turn out to be, from the perspective of archaeology anyway, relatively new. In his book, Making Sex, Thomas LeCure showed that perceptions of the sexed body changed radically from antiquity until the 20th century. Even when the physical differences between the sexes were recognized, they were not important until the end of the 1700s, when they were used in arguments for or against the role of women in education and public life. Queer theory reminds us that classifications are not neutral. They are created in specific cultural contexts in relation to specific questions and often to make a specific argument. Even the distinction between sex as biology and gender as culture has been questioned by queer theory. Judith Butler has argued that our standard sex versus gender model often reduces gender to sex and tends to create normative and non-normative gender categories which can be as simplistic as racial categories. For example, warrior women like the Señora de Cao of ancient Peru are seen by us as an exotic gender type, but imagery from the past often does not represent these women as non-normative at all. In ancient Maya art, women warriors are depicted just like their male counterparts. So, distinguishing men from women does not always seem to be all that central to ancient imagery, and mixed-gender people and deities are common in many cultures. Kent Riley and others have used analogies to historically known and living indigenous two-spirit people to explain mixed-gender imagery in Maya art. How does this reevaluation of gender and sex relate to sexuality? The historian Michel Foucault influentially argued that sex and sexuality are embedded in discourses shaped by power. More recently, the historian David Halperin described the problems inherent in applying our contemporary concepts of sexuality to other places and times, because Western culture itself did not associate homosexual behaviors with a fixed and permanent homosexual identity until the late 1800s. This attention to categorizations and binaries is a hallmark of queer theory, because categorizations of people and their actions depend on ideas about what is normal and also what is deviant. Both feminism and queer theory use the concepts of intersectionality and positionality in approaching gender, sex, and sexuality. Both are related to the idea that people have multiple aspects to their personality that they emphasize or downplay in different contexts. Many societies take pains to gender individuals with objects, tasks, and food, yet we repeatedly see that gender is not as important in the very old and the very young, and that gender is often most strongly marked when people are of reproductive age. Similar criticisms can be made about the often implicit assumption that sexuality was as important in the creation of identity as in the past as it is now. Fugelsveld suggests that we consider a scale of intensity for societal interest in sex, gender, and sexuality. In those terms, many contemporary people live in societies with unusually high-intensity attitudes to gender, sex, and sexuality. The archaeologist Lynn Meskel and others have called for more contextual, intersectional studies focused on individuals, not groups. In this view, quote, prehistoric identities do not rely on the notion of a core, stable self that remains unchanged throughout the life course. Instead, identity is context-dependent and enacted or embodied in ways that capture the lived experiences of past peoples. For example, in a study of the early historical Chumash of California, Sandra Holloman argued that undertakers were either men who engaged in homosexual acts, including third-gender people, or postmenopausal women. They were categorized together because their sexual activity did not result in conception and birth. In this case, occupation, age, and reproductive potential intersected with gender and sexual behavior in a classification system that differs greatly from familiar contemporary ones. Religion, status, and sexuality were also often linked in the past in ways that surprise contemporary Westerners. The ancient Moche of Peru produced a huge number of sexually explicit pottery vessels that were often placed in high-status burials. Mary Weissmantel and others linked the sexual imagery not to sexual identity, but to politics and power, including dependent relationships with dead ancestors. Similarly, Michael Horswell has described the religious use of male same-sex sexuality in the Andes, and others have done the same for Mesoamerica. In studies of the Americas, many authors have argued that the intersection of gender, sexuality, and status intensified during the European invasion and subsequent colonial period, leading to increased oppression of women and others of all sorts. For more on this topic, see Joseph Russo's chapter in LGBTQ Studies, An Open Introduction. Some indigenous cultures, for example the Maya and the Aztecs, shared with the Spanish the idea that people conquered in war were gendered feminine, and sodomy was a metaphor for conquest. Europeans in the New World sought to eliminate, often brutally, expressions of gender and sexuality that did not correspond with their Inquisition-era ideas. Yet, one of the insidious legacies of colonialism in general is the widespread idea that indigenous cultures were always conservative and restrictive around issues of gender, sex, and sexuality, when in many cases that conservatism was imposed on them during colonization. Archaeologists and our colleagues in cultural anthropology and history are showing instead that many cultures held diverse ideas about these issues, and that this evidence must be understood on its own terms, not on ours. I hope that in this short overview I've given you some indication that academics in many fields now challenge normative classifications of people and behavior. Michel Foucault wrote about the role of experts in science and medicine in the creation of normative categories. Archaeologists are some of those experts, and would become more self-critical about our interpretations of issues around sex, gender, and sexuality in recent decades. Archaeologists who engage with these issues are not just trying to dig up LGBTQ people, we're trying to challenge normativity in all its forms. Thanks for watching.